It is good to be with you all in worship this morning. I know that I said my name when I did announcements, but I'll say it again. My name is Brandi Horton. If we haven't met yet, I'm often at our West Campus, and so it's a real treat to be with you all downtown. One of my first friends in seminary, one of my dearest friends in seminary, I should probably say, was a woman named Kim. Kim is 11 years my senior. She is 6 inches my taller. She has blonde hair, and yet somehow we just matched. We just went together. During the first year that we were in seminary in the fall, her dad died unexpectedly of a heart attack. And then 6 months later, her mom died with cancer. And we matched. So I knew that things were hard. I knew that things weren't great. And one day I would drop muffins off at her house about once a week to see if maybe I could entice her to eat some breakfast. And one day I walked into Greek class, and in my seat, the seat next to me where Kim should have been, it was empty. And so I called, and all she could say was, "Brandi, I just can't get off the floor." So my Greek professor waved me out of the classroom. I got in my car. I drove to Kim's house. I let myself in. I walked down her stairs, and I opened her bedroom door, and sure enough, there she was on the floor with her head in her hands. So I said, "Would you like to move to the bed or maybe the couch?" She just shook her head no. I said, "Do you want some Kleenex?" She shook her head. Said, "Well, maybe you're hungry. Would you like to get up and eat?" She just shook her head. And I have to tell you that in that moment, I had no idea what to do. I knew that I could not take her pain away from her. But I'll be honest, I was not thinking about what Jesus would do or what the pastor that I hoped I would one day become would do. I didn't know what to do. So I did the only thing that made any sense at all to me. And I took off my shoes, and I laid down on the floor with her. The truth is that at some point, we all end up on the floor with our head in our hands. At some point, we all end up not wanting the tissues, not wanting the food, not wanting to move, just needing a moment to wallow. At some point, we're all going to end up worn out, uncertain, fearful, overwhelmed, or just flat out down. And that's where we meet Elijah this morning. We find Elijah sitting under a broom tree asking God to take his life because he's just not sure that it's worth much anymore. When you're reading this story as a whole, this section feels maybe a bit disjointed, a bit out of place. Elijah was a prophet of the Lord, and he was one of the best. He had just had a huge success. And the chapter right before this one, chapter 18, Elijah challenges 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah to build altars to their gods and to call down fire from heaven. The point is that whoever's God answers with the fire from heaven is the one true God. After a while of kind of waiting, Elijah even challenges these prophets to douse their altars 3 times with a bucket of water. Of course, the altars to Baal and Asherah remain completely intact, uncharred. There's no fire there. But the altar that Elijah built to the God of Israel is completely consumed. There's fire. It burns up the burnt offering. It burns up the wood that the burnt offering is on. It burns up the stones underneath that wood. It burns up the dust underneath the stones. And it even licks at the water that has pooled around it. It's a huge success. And after this happens, Elijah, in response, kills all of the prophets of Baal. You could say that he's had a pretty good day at the office. He was confident, he was authoritative, he was certain, he knew that he was going to win, and when he won, he acted on it. He was bold, even to the point that if you read back, he kind of mocks the people, the other gods. He says, well, maybe your God's in the bathroom, and that's why he's not responding with fire. It's really there. Go read it. So he is on top of the world. But when Jezebel threatens his life, all of that certainty, all of that sureness vanishes. All of that confidence is gone. And he's afraid. So he runs. Commentators have often wondered if this story was actually originally somewhere else in Elijah's life. They wonder if this was just kind of spliced in here, and it didn't, because it doesn't make sense to them. How could someone go from one day being a complete success, completely bold, completely sure, to the next day questioning absolutely everything? I get it. Anybody else get it? Yeah. I've had great days at work and then come home and looked at my husband and said, I don't really think I'm called. I've had good days as a parent where I made decent decisions, and then after Caroline goes to bed, I thought, oh my goodness, what did I do? I've had days surrounded by family and friends, and then after they've all left, thought, did anybody hear me today? Has anybody else had that experience? You get what it's like to go from one extreme to the other in a matter of hours, minutes, days. When Elijah gets to the wilderness, the word that he uses underneath the broom tree, it was translated actually in the song and in our translation this morning as "it is enough." But a better translation from the Hebrew would be, it is too much. It has all become too much for Elijah. He wants to die. He is sitting under that broom tree because it's too much. And I'm pretty sure that every time we end up under the broom tree, every time we end up on the floor with our head in our hands, it's because it's too much. It's too much grief for us to bear. It's too much responsibility for us to shoulder. It's too much fatigue for us to overcome. It's too much work for us to do. It's too much uncertainty for us to navigate. It's too much. It's too much fear. It's too much pain. It's too much chaos. It's just too much. Have you all heard that aphorism that God won't give you more than you can handle? It's wrong. It's not in the Bible. It would be much more accurate to say that the world can't give you more than God can handle. God's not dishing out the things that are too much, and you are not asked to handle them. Scripture is not telling you to try harder, to pick yourself up by your bootstraps, to do more work, to be better. The passage about Elijah is not about Elijah freeing himself from his darkness. It's not about Elijah getting himself out from under that broom tree. This passage is about how God meets Elijah there. So when you're in the wilderness, when you are under the broom tree, when you are on the floor with your head in your hands, when it's too much, God meets you there. The wilderness is sometimes an invitation to rest a while, to be taken care of, and to learn that we are not alone. A couple of years ago, there was a story about a break-in at a preschool in New Orleans. Overnight, a man broke into the preschool. He made his way over those child-sized chairs and cribs, and their surveillance cameras captured the whole thing. And what they realized is, as they were watching it later, is that as he went from room to room, he was picking up goldfish and pretzels and Cheerios and juice boxes, and he was snacking as he went. Then after he was done kind of getting what he wanted to get, he went into a classroom and he made himself a pallet. And he laid down and he took a nap till about 6:45 in the morning. Then he left with some stolen goods in tow. But my guess is that he felt better on his way out than he did on his way in. And not just because of whatever he stole. I'm not really sure what you steal from a preschool, but not just because of that, but because sometimes we all need a nap and a snack. I live with a toddler. I can tell you from firsthand experience, maybe you've lived with a toddler too. I can tell you from firsthand experience that when there's a meltdown, when, not if, because it's going to happen, when there's a meltdown, my first thought is, she needs a nap. And my second thought is, she needs a snack. Often toddler meltdowns come from being overwhelmed. There's just been too much. There's been too much stimulation, too much activity, too much being off of our schedule. We know this about people that are this tall, but somehow when we get to be this tall, maybe this tall, maybe this tall, I don't know where you are, but somehow when we get a little bit taller, we forget the goodness that a nap and a snack can provide. We think we're exempt from that. But if you read the passage this morning, God knows that Elijah can't listen when he's like this. God knows that he's not going to be able to tell Elijah anything new in the middle of a meltdown. God can't reason with him or push him into the new places he needs him to go, so God lets him fall asleep. God makes the wilderness a place of rest. There's real practical wisdom in this. Even though scientists really struggle to study sleep, it's just a hard topic, they do know that sleep is absolutely necessary for our survival. That sleep is good for healing and rejuvenation. That sleep is actually not about your body and your mind shutting down. We know that when we sleep, our brains are actually constantly working. They're working out things that happened in your day. They're sorting through your emotions. Your brain is getting ready to learn something new when you sleep. Your brain is encoding data and helping you understand things during your sleep. So when Elijah comes to the broom tree with too much, scientifically, the best possible thing for him to do was sleep. Rest. Let the brain work out your troubles and prepare to learn something new later. But when we have too much, I think our greatest temptation is to keep going, to work harder. We somehow think that rest is beneath us, that we'll sleep when we're dead, that productivity is a measure of our worth, that we'll be able to solve the problems on our own. But over and over again, the Bible invites us to stop, to Sabbath, to take a nap. Because in doing so, we acknowledge that we have limits, that we are human, and that God is not. God will take care of us while we rest. God invites us to take a nap because God knows that we need it. I'm one of those people that makes a meal plan at the beginning of a week. I make a meal plan, I make a grocery list, I buy the groceries, I stick to the plan. So the week before our daughter Caroline was born, I did what I do best. I made a meal plan, I bought the groceries, and then I decided to debrief my mother on how this was all going to work, how to cook the dinner. need to tell you that my mom taught home economics for 35 years. As it turns out, I know how to cook dinner because Mom knows how to cook dinner. She didn't need it. But then this strange thing happened. The day that we arrived home from the hospital, our phones started ringing, our doorbells started ringing, and friends and colleagues and church members kept dropping by, and they never showed up empty-handed. We had roasted chicken and mixed vegetable casseroles. The pastor from the church next to our house brought us authentic Chinese food because he's Chinese. We had dairy-free desserts, and we have things from my favorite takeout restaurants. My fridge was fuller than I had ever seen it, and I didn't plan any of it. It was all gift. It was all grace. The only experience that I had to compare that to was death. The only time that I had seen that much variety in cuisine was when a grandparent had died, and the revolving door just kept bringing in more casseroles and more kinds of deviled eggs. There are more than one kind, in case you didn't know, and more fried chicken. You see, when someone dies or a baby is born, something in our brains says, bake. It's because I think we know the power of being fed. We know that when we are fed, we are cared for. Feeding is a way that we care for each other, and it's a way that God cares for us. Elijah is allowed to sleep, but then he's woken up to eat. It's food that's both soothing and filling. The angel says that he needs to eat or the journey will be too much for him. One meal lasts Elijah 40 days in the wilderness. It's comfort food. There's a researcher at State University in New York that studies comfort food. What makes comfort food comfort food? And if you believe it, it's actually not the calorie content, and it's actually not the food itself. It actually has more to do with the relationships that food represents. Comfort food is comforting when it represents a relationship. So chicken soup is more comforting when you remember your mom making it for you when you're sick. Ice cream is more comforting if you remember eating it out of the tub with your dad. Those roasted chicken and all of those vegetable casseroles were more comforting because I remembered the well-wishers dropping them off. Comfort food is fuel for our journeys through parenthood and through grief and through fear and through uncertainty and the unknown and sadness, because it's the relationships that carry us through to the other side. The wilderness is about a nap and a snack, but it's also about the relationships that will get Elijah to the other side of the wilderness. It's about learning that even though he has done everything he can to isolate himself, he has left his servant behind and gone into the wilderness alone. Even though he has tried to be completely solitary, Elijah is still not alone. In verse 5, our translation says that an angel came to Elijah and woke him up. But the word for angel is actually the word for messenger. It's the same word that's used earlier in the chapter to say that Jezebel had sent a messenger to Elijah. So there's a little bit of confusion about whether this was a messenger like Jezebel had sent, a messenger of death, or whether this could possibly be a messenger of life. In the wilderness and under the broom tree, perhaps we only expect to see a messenger of death to relieve Elijah of his pain. Perhaps the wilderness feels so desolate that we have forgotten to even look for signs of life. But if there's anything that I've learned in this sermon series on wilderness, it's that the wilderness is never as isolated or barren or desolate as we like to think it is. God is always sending messengers of life, even when all we see around us is death. God is always giving strength to the tempted and clothes to the naked and food to the hungry and rest to the weary, even in the wilderness, maybe especially in the wilderness. For the last several weeks, I have been taking note of all of the places that God is sending me messages and messengers of life, places that I rarely notice. And I started this practice actually when we were preaching the Exodus passage on manna, because that week I had received some difficult news, and the night that I had gotten that news, a friend surprised me by showing up at our house after Caroline had gone to bed and taking me out for dessert. And when I got home, David looked at me and he said, "Brandi, you know that's manna, right?" And so then I realized that there have to be all kinds of places where God is giving me good news. So earlier this week, I was in the DMV for several hours, a wilderness if there ever was one. And this woman saw how far down the line my ticket number was, and she needed to leave to go to work. And so she looked and she said, "Ma'am, would you like my ticket? I'd like to give it to you." A messenger of hope, if there ever was one. And then on Thursday, I was meeting with my covenant group, and I was getting ready to tell them about this spiritual practice and about how I have been paying so much better attention to the ways that God has been good to me. And then I looked around and I realized that every seat at my table was full, and my table was bursting with food. And I realized that right in front of me, there was food and companionship for whatever journey was ahead. So maybe you're not in a season of wilderness. Maybe you are, but maybe you're not. Either way, I invite you to start opening your eyes to all the ways that God is offering to be present with you, to feed you, to give you rest, to strengthen you for your journey. They're there if we just pay attention. My favorite creed, because I really am as much of a method nerd as Pastor Andy says that I am. My favorite creed begins this way, and I have one of those. It begins, "We are not alone. We live in God's world." The idea is that as long as we are in God's world, we are never without God. There is nowhere that we can go. There is no wilderness we can traverse. There is no mountain we can climb. There is no sea that is too deep so that we could ever escape the presence of God. So when you find yourself under the broom tree, when you find yourself on the floor with your head in your hands, God is not absent even in that moment. God doesn't walk away because you can't handle it. God isn't frustrated that it's too much. Instead, God does the only thing that makes any sense. And God gets on the floor with you. And God will stay there until you're strong enough to get up again. Let's pray.